It takes a crisis, great turning points in American history. I'm really happy this evening that you all are joining us. My name is Randy Voller. I'm a former mayor of Pittsburgh. I did my 4 terms in local government. I was the state party chairman of the North Carolina Democratic Party, the chair of the Rural Planning Organization, held a few other hats. Tonight I'm wearing this nice Panama hat, and I've gotten involved with this organization because I believe this is really the policy that we need to be pushing going forward. And tonight we're going to have a great call starting with Alphecca Muttardy. Some of you have heard from her before and some of you have not, but Alphecca is a professional macroeconomist, a former senior economist, the International Monetary Fund, former IMF senior desk economist for Ghana and Liberia Africa Department, and former IMF senior economist, Treasurer's Department. So Alphecca, if you could take us away to kind of give us the backstory, and then after you, I'll introduce Maryjane, and then we'll get to Professor Brains.
Great. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. Great to see so many faces again. We have an exciting lineup of great speakers tonight, myself notwithstanding, but we have Professor Brand here, Maryjane Shimsky here. This is going to be an exciting evening to talk about is the United States in a crisis? And if so, then what can we do about it? So I'm going to briefly get started by talking about the economic details as I see them as a macroeconomist, just to sort of set things up. So I hope everybody can see my slides okay. The question is, are we in a crisis? From a macroeconomic point of view, I would say, yes, we are, or we're at least at the cusp of one. And you can see this on a couple of charts, very easy economic charts. The first one is on income inequality. This is the percentage of income, the whole pie of everybody's income in the United States, that is taken by the top 1% of income earners. Used to be very high in the Gilded Age around 1900 to 1920. And then it precipitously went down to 1970, but now it is back up where it was in the Gilded Age. This is really hurting the lower 50% of the population. We have rising homelessness, food insecurity, deaths from lack of health care, and principally, this has had a political impact, as you saw in the last election with how people voted. Registering their dissatisfaction. In addition to that, we have bubbles everywhere. A stock bubble, a bond bubble, a crypto bubble, a derivatives bubble. All of that is going to whiplash back eventually onto the financial system. There's a whole backstory for how that works. You can look at my latest newsletter to get an explanation. Record federal debt. Here's where we were at the top of our federal debt as a percent of GDP at the end of World War I. Very, very high. Then a precipitous decline. How that happened, we didn't pay it back. We grew out of it. But we are now back up to that same debt level as a percent of GDP, and no end in sight to how this is going to keep on going. With the latest budget that President Trump just passed, it's going to keep on growing. $2 trillion a year is being added on, and that was to give tax cuts to the very wealthy. And on top of that, our infrastructure is crumbling. The real sector is gutted. We produce everything overseas now. That's very similar to where it was back in the Depression when all of businesses were shuttered. There's a few differences between today and those recession days, but really what they show is that inflation is going up, pushed by Trump's tariffs. Employment is low, but don't forget, a lot of people are being taken out of the country. Immigrants are being rounded up by ICE and exported. And wages are flat. So even though people are employed, they're really still very suffering and hurting. And tariffs and monopolies are scheduled to make inflation much, much worse. I see, as an economist, a big recession coming. And I'm not the only one. All of the economists are now lining up within the last couple of weeks, also predicting one. I point you out to the recent piece by David Dayen, who's usually middle of the road, but on August 19th, he called it. We're in a really bad shape and heading into a recession. So I don't think we've seen anything yet as bad as this crisis is going to get, I think it's going to get much worse. So what can we do, and how can we get out of such a crisis? We're going to talk. Professor Brandt is going to talk a lot about how FDR's policy, how it helped the very poor and went against the moneyed interests of the well-off. I see it was organized under four broad categories to help workers with things like minimum wage, Social Security, Medicare. Here's FDR signing the Social Security Act, now 90 years old last week. Another leg of his policy was busting up the big trusts. Now we have monopolies being built up, not busted down under this administration. He also implemented new income taxes on the wealthy to make them pay their fair share. We've just had a big fat tax break for the rich. And he had an off-budget financing of infrastructure and farm supports that put people back to work and actually doubled economic growth. And this was the big economic push of his administration. And you could see that in the outcome from the activities of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the previous bank that was started by Republican Herbert Hoover, but FDR picked it up, got it made bigger and bigger and bigger, and put people to work in great paying jobs, building infrastructure. It was often called the fourth arm of government. It was so large, it was bigger than the United States budget. It was bigger than all the commercial banks combined. And it was off budget, so it was able to finance everything. Built big things like TVA and Hoover Dam, lent to governments for roads, schools, public buildings, and housing after World War II. So it doubled GDP growth, it tripled unskilled wage levels, it helped to win World War II, and it even, you could arguably say, saved capitalism. So a national infrastructural bank will be a similar solution, especially if we get worse into this crisis. A national infrastructure bank is big enough to fix all of our nation's infrastructure. It's, again, off budget, long-term reliable financing. It doesn't need new taxes, spending, or debt. Creates millions and millions of great paying jobs. It'll raise those stagnant wages. It'll lower inflation, especially the cost of housing. It'll make America competitive, build American businesses, make our much more productive. For example, end traffic congestion. We would all love that. And fundamentally, it will double GDP growth and improve federal and state budgets and ensure that all the loans are repaid. So that's my setup. And so I look forward to hearing what the other speakers are going to say as well. Thank you very much.
That was excellent, Alphecca. So from there, we're going to build on with Assemblywoman Maryjane Shimsky from the 92nd New York Assembly. In her first term, she's helped secure $100 million in additional road and bridge funding in the state budget. As a 12-year Westchester County legislator, she was responsible for advancing hundreds of construction projects for roads, sewers, parks, and other public facilities, just the basic things that we need in our community to make them the places that we want to live. She's a native of Scranton, Pennsylvania, graduated from Yale University and New York University School of Law, and earned her PhD in history from City University of New York. So, Maryjane, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Randy, and thank you so much to the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank for calling attention to this critical issue and coming up with a solution. I am so honored to be on this panel. Alphecca and I have fought the wars together for a while now, and it is so good that party officials like you, Randy, are getting involved in public policy. We need more of a nexus between those two things. And I was so delighted to learn that Professor Brandt, who wrote one of my favorite biographies, The First American, about Benjamin Franklin, was coming on tonight. I guess what I'm going to do is sort of a link between our two speakers. We know we are in economic crisis at this point, but what is going to be a transformative crisis? What is going to bring things to the point where we can get serious change and serious investment in our country? Over the last 10 years or so, I think I've come up with at least 6 or 7 different emerging, potentially existential crises in this country. While I was thinking about this tonight, I realized our crumbling infrastructure is not going to be on that list because the vast majority of people, including elected officials, including public policy people, don't connect the dots between different infrastructure systems in that way. And even if they were inclined to, they don't have the knowledge to do so. For example, people understand our roads are in bad shape because they drive them every day. But as long as their dams work and as long as their power grid works and as long as their sewers work, it's out of sight, out of mind for them. So the crises we're talking about have to be somewhat different, but at least 3 of them that I could think of have a huge infrastructure component. One is the affordability crisis, which we are in right now, and the evidence for which Alphecca basically laid out for us. It's the kind of issue that is not only transformative, I mean, it has caused many a revolution on this world. But there are non-infrastructure components to it, much of which Alphecca laid out, but there are infrastructure components as well. One of which is housing. Housing is the biggest expense in most families' budgets. According to a sampling of studies I pulled together, the housing shortage in this country is probably somewhere around 5 million units. The bulk of that shortage is for people of low incomes, modest incomes, people who cannot afford to work as well. The cost of siting and building 5 million new homes is going to be over $1 trillion. Another infrastructure component of the affordability crisis is the rising cost of utilities. In New York State, out of a state of 19 million people, 1.3 million ratepayers are behind in their utility bills now, and there are big increases coming. National Grid, for example, is going to be charging 20% more for electricity and 27% more for gas over the next 3 years. Con Edison, which provides electricity and gas to nearly half the state, is asking for a 13.3% increase in gas and an 11.4% increase in electricity just for next year. They say that this is part of a need to repair distribution infrastructure and move toward a carbon-free system. A third infrastructure-related component is supply chain. We've seen what gaps in the supply chain could do to prices during COVID. Just imagine what happens if we have major breaches in our road infrastructure, major breaches in our water system. Water is an essential ingredient in both agriculture and in just about any industrial process. We need to consider what this can do to consumer prices. The second one is climate resiliency. I consider this separately from climate change and energy transition because the number of natural disasters that we are beginning to get is going to cause the kind of violence to people's everyday lives that they just won't ignore it anymore. For example, one study concluded that 100-year storms are now really 25-year storms. In coastal North Carolina, there have been 9 100-year storms in the past 25 years. And we've seen in the news the forest fires in Canada happening every year, the wiping out of entire communities in California. You can see the financial havoc in the precipitous rise in homeowners insurance in Florida, which is, their policies have been rising, the premiums have been rising an average of 40% in the past 3 years. In California, there are people whose homeowners policies have doubled and tripled in cost because of the wildfires. Now, inflation and other factors play a role, but it is no coincidence that the biggest crises in homeowner insurance rates in this country are taking place in Florida and in California. With these disasters comes the need to rebuild housing and infrastructure systems. And we even see it in places other than California or in Florida. I'm inland New York State, one of the places that people kind of think of as a safe one. But we're already seeing in Westchester County the kind of doors used to create safe spaces on warships and submarines are now being used to keep water out of wastewater treatment plants and American Legion posts. The growing need to move boilers and other building infrastructure out of the basements is becoming really acute because there are people whose basements flood on a seasonal basis at this point. And we also have roads being washed out in Rockland County on a regular basis as well. We're going to have to figure out how to reprioritize, where to move roads, where to move people, and what we can do to make existing facilities more resilient. And then, of course, we are going to have to make changes in how we fuel our societies and economies. Humankind has gone through these before, but you know what? We're going to have to do it at a much faster rate at this point. Carbon-free power generation, changes to our electrical distribution system so that power can be moved from new locations where it's generated. EV charging stations, retrofitting of old buildings where possible, and new construction where it's not. We will be able to create the greatest economic expansion in a century if we're willing to make the investments. The National Infrastructure Bank gives us a mechanism for providing a large chunk of the funding that we are going to need to make all these things happen, to solve all of these crises. That is why I am so thrilled to be a supporter of the Coalition for a National Infrastructure Bank. And I'm proud to join so many office holders in this country supporting it as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maryjane. Before we move on to Professor Brands, I want to add just one quick thing. I had a guest on my show this last week, Adam Edlin, who was the former state auditor of Kentucky and was Governor Beshear's chief of staff, the elder, not the younger. And he told me, as he's working in renewables in coal country, so really red areas in eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Western Carolina, that there's a macabre thing going on where people take pictures of their utility bills, their food bills, their housing costs, and energy is more expensive than their housing cost. And it's just shameful. And people can't afford to stay in the houses that basically their grandparents lived in. So this is going on right now in America. People really are feeling this. So Professor Brands, I'm really happy and proud. I met you on a call that we did about 3 weeks ago that you came on. Professor Brands holds a Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written 30 books, co-authored or edited 5 others, and published dozens of articles and scores of reviews. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic Monthly, the Smithsonian, American History, and many other newspapers, magazines, and journals. His writings have received critical and popular acclaim. The First American, The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin, and Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Prize. Several of his books have been bestsellers. Thank you for joining the call, and please take it away.
Okay, I'm going to tell you a story that's based on a personal experience that's related to that book cover you just saw. In the autumn of 2008, I published a biography of Franklin Roosevelt, and it was part of my canny strategic thinking that the book was published during the election campaign of 2008. I had plotted it years ahead, because I was convinced, with very many other people, that in 2008, Hillary Clinton was going to be the Democratic nominee for president. And people were going to look at Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and say, boy, what an amazing political power couple. Have there been any power couples like that in American history? And they would say, aha, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And they were going to see my book on the bookstand, and they were going to all buy the book. Well, things didn't work out exactly that way. Hillary Clinton did not get the 2008 Democratic nomination. Barack Obama did, and he got elected. And when he got elected, well, the reason he got elected, the primary reason he got elected was that the US economy was in free fall from the summer through the autumn of 2008. And it pretty much negated the arguments of the Republicans and John McCain and all this other stuff. And so people were willing to take a try with Obama. So on the strength of the book and sort of the timing of the book, this new book on Franklin Roosevelt, at a time when the United States appeared to be on the verge of Great Depression 2.0. And so President Obama was one of the more historically minded presidents we've ever had. And he decided that it would be a good idea to invite some historians to the White House to have what amounted to sort of a by command of the president historical seminar. And there were actually several installments of this, but the first one took place in the spring of 2009. And it sort of reflected, some of you perhaps will remember the cover of Time magazine. It was in about December of 2008. So after Barack Obama had been elected, but before he took office. And this was an example of, I don't know if you could get away with these days, but it was a Photoshopped cover. And it was a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in his characteristic, the open-ended car that he always rode in. And he had his head at that jaunty angle, and he had his cigarette on his cigarette holder, and he had that smile on his face, except that instead of the face of Franklin Roosevelt, the face of Barack Obama had been photoshopped in. And the caption above the picture said, Franklin Delano Obama, ? So is Barack Obama going to be the next Franklin Roosevelt? And so I guess because they thought maybe I could shed some light on this, the folks who were organizing the White House dinner invited me. So sure, I was going to come. And President Obama stood up. I think there were maybe 12 or 15 of us around the dinner table. And President Obama stood up and welcomed us all there and sort of explained his and his administration's thinking about where they stood in the long scheme of American history and what they hoped for the administration. And President Obama, I wouldn't say that he's not a professional student of history, but he's a smart guy, well-read, and he knows his history. And he talked about the difference between sort of status quo presidencies and transformative presidencies. Maryjane mentioned the transformation part. Well, and this kind of standard stuff in political science terminology. And President Obama identified the key transformative presidencies in American history, chiefly the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. Lincoln because of the Civil War, and Franklin Roosevelt because of the Great Depression and World War II. And he said, and Barack Obama was not a boastful person, but he was also not excessively immodest, and he hoped that his administration would be one of those transformative administrations because he believed that there were these big challenges facing the United States. So I happened to be sitting around the table just right next to him, and I had sort of a puzzle, a bit of a dilemma that was occurring to me while he was speaking. And it had to do with a question of sort of protocol or maybe just simple politeness. What do you do when you're invited over to somebody's house for dinner? And they make this statement that you think is quite wrong-headed. What do? Do you speak up and say, I think you're nuts? And is it complicated by the fact that in this case, your host is the President of the United States? Well, I thought about it for a few moments. And then I thought, well, the President of the United States is a busy guy. And he wouldn't be wasting his time, take 2 hours out of his evening just to hear himself talk. So I assume that he invited us there to hear what we had to say. So at first reasonable opportunity, I said, excuse me, I appreciate your comment on American history and the presidencies that were transformative, all this. And I understand why any president just entering office would like to think that historians will think of him or her in the same light or vein as they think of Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt. And that's big stuff. I said, however, I'd like to point out a seeming paradox of American history. And the paradox is this, that the greatest presidents presided over the worst times in American history. Think about it for a moment. What's the absolute worst half decade of American history? The Civil War. Americans killed 600, 700,000 of each other. You know, you can't get any worse than that. Well, maybe the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt comes close because it was the worst economic disaster in American history. And as was pointed out just a moment ago, there were 25% of the population was unemployed, and the Depression went on and on and on. And then the United States took part. The United States descended into the worst war in human history that killed between 40 and 60 million people. So I said, unless you're expecting another Civil War or another Great Depression, World War II, perhaps you should reconsider. Perhaps the model for the presidency, for your presidency, should not be Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason that these great presidents emerge in these critical times, because the machinery of American government is overwhelmingly stacked in favor of the status quo. You have to get all the pieces pointing in the same direction at the same time to make any big changes, and that rarely happens. It only happens when the status quo has become so clearly discredited that people are going to say, okay, the system isn't working anymore. We have to make some huge changes. Now, during the Civil War, of course, the Union was falling apart, and the troublesome half of the country was on the other side. Depending on which side you were on, the other half was the troublesome part. But the whole point is, and it led to the domination of all the branches of the federal government by one party. This is important. And then with Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, the same thing. The Great Depression was triggered by the stock market crash of 1929, and Herbert Hoover is president. And the economy goes down and down and down and down, and it keeps going down. Until by the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated, the country was 3.5 years into this depression. It was the worst thing people had ever seen. It was very clear that whatever had been done by the Hoover administration wasn't working. And so something needs to be changed. And what changed was not simply the presidency, of course, but control of Congress. And so Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated in 1933 with enormous Democratic majorities in Congress. Again, this is crucial, because if you're going to make these big changes, you have to get all the pieces of the federal government pointing in the same direction. And I should add, by the way, as well, that the Supreme Court held out against Roosevelt for a few years until finally there were some retirements, and some of them were scared by Roosevelt's threat to pack the Supreme Court. And so they changed their minds, and then they changed their personnel. So I'm saying all this by way of cautioning fans of a national infrastructure bank to get in the position where it almost seems as though they're rooting for a crisis. They're rooting for things to get worse. And I certainly understand the motivation. And in fact, this is, in terms of how things will play out, if this is going to happen, that's probably how it will play out. But if you convey the idea that you're saying, okay, we got this economic crisis and it's going to get worse, well, you're not going to get any political credit if you say, well, we saw it coming. Because the strange thing about the connection between economics and politics is that if you predict something, if you're simply an economist and you're saying this bad stuff is going to come, because look at the deficit, look at all this other stuff. Politically, it sounds like you were there hoping it was going to happen. And the other thing is, I'll just add, and this is all by way of saying that I hope the National Infrastructure Bank gains traction. But I also hope it doesn't occur by the same means it happened during the 1930s. Because whatever the blessings of infrastructure and the Reconstruction Enhanced Corporation, all this stuff, the Great Depression remains a huge disaster in American history, and lives were ruined for decades, and families were disrupted, and agendas were thrown out of kilter, and all this other stuff. So what I said to President Obama, I said, instead of modeling your presidency on Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt, these are the two top, and then you throw in George Washington, but nobody can be akin to George Washington because we only get one first president. Maybe you ought to look a little bit lower down the league tables of the presidency. Now, at that time, I said, you might think about Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was as progressive in his time as Franklin Roosevelt. And he got a lot of stuff done. He moved things along. He created the national forest system and all sorts of other he laid the foundation for the modern liberal state. But from the standpoint of the American people and from the standpoint of politics, he presided over 7.5 years of peace and prosperity. And so he demonstrated that you can make progressive progress, you can make reforms without requiring a crisis. And you'll get credit for doing so. Now, in the case of Theodore Roosevelt, he was basically able to poach like-minded people from the opposite party. He was a Republican. He was a progressive Republican. And most Republicans were conservative and opposed to the kind of things he wanted to do. But there were a bunch of progressive Democrats with whom he could make common cause. Now, it's important to note that politics in those days, party politics, were different than they are today. Party politics today is very different from party politics in the 1900s, 1910s, very different from the party politics of the 1930s and 1940s, very different from the politics even of the 1980s. The political parties have become sifted out almost perfectly philosophically, so that there are no liberal Republicans. There are no conservative Democrats. And until the 1980s, there was enough overlap between left and right that you could find middle ground that was absolutely crucial to making these reforms and making these reforms stick. So when I'm talking about this stuff, it's important. I certainly acknowledge that times have changed politically. But nonetheless, I suggested to President Obama that maybe Theodore Roosevelt would be a better model than Franklin Roosevelt. Now, we had the dinner, left, went home. I came back to Texas, and I got an email the day after that from the member of the White House staff who organized the event. He said, "Thank you, Professor Brands, for coming this way. We're very interested to hear what you had to say," and so on and so on, and the polite kind of stuff. But at the last line of the email, he said, "But we still think this can be a transformative presidency." However, when, perhaps as you will remember, the Great Recession of 2008 did not become the Great Depression of 2009. When the economic situation stabilized a little bit, the Obama White House steered very clear of making connections to Franklin Roosevelt, because they really didn't want to see that Franklin Delano Obama come out, because that would bring back memories of the Great Depression and World War II. They didn't want that. Instead, I don't know if you would remember this, but I think it was in maybe the beginning of 2000. Yeah, it was in 2010, because on the 100th anniversary of a speech given by Theodore Roosevelt, who at that point was a former president, but he was beginning to plan a run again in 1912. He gave a speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, in which he announced the program that he called the New Nationalism. And it was this same kind of ambitious use of federal power to fix the problem that faced the United States. And I should point out that the biggest federal project underway at the time was the Panama Canal. And so Barack Obama in 2010, on the 100th anniversary of that speech, went to Osawatomie, Kansas, to give his speech about his understanding of what his administration should aim for. And of course, the journalists saying, well, why Osawatomie, Kansas? And someone called me. I said, well, that's because where Theodore Roosevelt announced it. I didn't say, I told him he ought to channel Theodore Roosevelt, but there were people who said, okay, there it is. So I would suggest perhaps Theodore Roosevelt or another peacetime president, another prosperity president, and one more directly applicable to a national infrastructure bank is Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was the father of the interstate highway system, the biggest public works project in American history. And one of the things that made it work for Eisenhower, and people who have a keener political insight than I will have to figure out how to finesse this. But do you know what made the interstate highway system work? Do you know what made it fly in 1956 when it finally passed? It wasn't that America all of a sudden needed highways. America had needed highways since the Model T was invented. And it wasn't just that suburbs were growing. Well, there had been suburbs around before. But what gave it that added little bit to push it over the top was the fact that Eisenhower could portray stronger infrastructure as essential to American security in the Cold War. In fact, the National Highway Defense Act, which was the name of it, defense, there would talk about how, well, they stressed, so we can quickly move troops from coast to coast. They said, sort of a little bit more quietly, oh yeah, we can also evacuate cities in case there's a nuclear war. If you don't have to stop at stoplights getting all the way out of Manhattan or wherever you might be. But what this enabled Eisenhower to do was to take this coalition of people who for years had thought building highways, improving America's highways, beefing up the infrastructure, building the roads and tunnels and all the other stuff to go with us. People, a lot of groups had thought that was a good idea for years. I mean, start with the car makers, start with the auto workers union, start with the construction people, start with the folks who worked on construction. Think about all the people, all the resources, everything that had to go into building this. And people who are in favor of the national infrastructure, maybe you've been thinking about this. All the different groups that would benefit from this. But until Eisenhower threw in that Cold War element, until then, members of Congress who were always being hectored by Eisenhower, among others, we got to balance the budget. We don't want this federal government to grow and grow and grow. So he was able to give them political cover. They could say, I'm voting for this because I believe in a strong defense. Now, I'm not saying exactly that you'll have better luck passing the National Infrastructure Bank if you call it the National Infrastructure Anti-China Bank. But do keep something like this in mind, because I've spoken to some of you and read a little bit about this. There are lots of groups who are in favor of it, but you don't have the rationale for somebody who doesn't want to be seen as a big spender and therefore is a little bit leery of signing on to this. And you can say it's off budget and all this, but it's money. And they're going to know that their political opponents will say, well, you voted for this trillion dollar project. So how can you provide them cover? Well, you can certainly say, this is an investment in America's future. Okay, that's gotten you sort of to where you are today. But if you can also say, it's going to make America stronger against, well, again, I don't want to say this is because we might go to war with China or something like that. But you got to come up with something that allows people who would feel vulnerable voting for it on just the kind of obvious infrastructure grounds, something that makes them able to fend off that attack and say, well, this is for national security. And of course, we'll spend whatever is necessary for national security. That's not profligate. That's simply good sense. So in Eisenhower's time, It was the Cold War, and the fact that Sputnik was launched the next year, made it, oh, see, Eisenhower was kind of ahead of the curve. So the long and the short of this is, if you wait for a crisis, well, the first thing I have to say is, we might or might not be on the verge of an economic crisis. But the only crisis that's actually going to make this project make sense is a political crisis. So the status quo has to get discredited if you're waiting for a crisis. And again, if we do come to a crisis, it's not at all clear that this is going to be the top item on other people's lists. Because, well, wait a minute, we got to deal with beef up Social Security. We got to do all this other stuff. So just sort of, I would suggest don't get fixed into this crisis way of thinking. And then the second thing is figure out how you can kind of broaden the base, because one of the great things, but it's also one of the challenges against pluralist politics. I mean, one of the challenges of pluralist politics is that, well, it's an opportunity and a challenge. It doesn't matter why people are voting for your bill. It just matters that enough of them do vote for your bill. And so in the natural sciences and philosophy, some of you will be familiar with the concept of Occam's razor, which is to reduce explanations, to just come up with the one explanation that really matters. Well, just the opposite holds in politics. You don't want to reduce the number of explanations. You want to multiply the number of explanations so that you might get 10% of legislators or voters voting for your project for this reason, because it's good it'll alleviate traffic congestion. And then you get 15% of it who will vote for it because it's a jobs bill. And then it'll get 15% will vote for it because it's good for the environment and all this other stuff. And maybe it's only going to take another 5 or 10% who will vote for it on national security grounds or whatever it is. So think of all the ways, all the explanations, all the rationalizations you can give for people to sign on. And then maybe we get something as big as Eisenhower got with the interstate highways. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Is Joanne Simon on the call? I don't know if she is.
Yes, and now my head is spinning.
Joanne, I know I wanted to give you a minute or two just to explain why you're for this, and if you wanted to ask any questions.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Professor Brands. That was a great presentation, really helpful in terms of thinking and maybe thinking differently. And thank you to my seatmate in chambers, Maryjane Shimsky, for her presentation. She's much smarter than I am. So she makes me look good. But I have been a supporter of the National Infrastructure Bank for a whole host of reasons, including the fact that in my neck of the woods, there are so many examples of things that could be done, should be done, would be done if we had the availability of the funding of a national infrastructure bank. Whether it's our roads and bridges, I've got those. Whether it's the environmental considerations, whether it's the water and sewer, that are systems that in New York City are extremely old and are exorbitantly expensive to rebuild or to make any major progress on. It's housing. Money into housing. We keep talking about needing to build more housing, but right now the model for building housing is relying on the private market with a couple of affordable units, which has, in fact, there was just a study done that showed that building more housing alone doesn't actually reduce the cost of housing. That the way it's being done and where it's being done, it's actually helping to increase the cost of housing. And they used as an example in this article, I think it was like in Cranes maybe recently, an area in my district, which is building 8,000 new units, and the prices are going up like crazy. And some of those 8,000 units are in fact deeply affordable. Doesn't matter. The costs are going up because we're funding it primarily through the private market and not with a mix of federal funding that once upon a time was available. So it's that access to capital that is really stymieing, policymakers from making better choices they know need to be made, but they can't do it. Right. So the National Infrastructure Bank is a mechanism that we know is tried and true, and we know will be successful if we can get it off the ground. But it is difficult, as you know, in today's times to be constructive in a way that is real, for lack of a better term. It's just very hard because people are not listening to what makes sense. And increasingly, there's so much division that even if you know it makes sense, you're not allowed to make sense. And so we just have such very divisive politics right now that it's a more difficult situation. So, you know, I think the notion of how this could be branded in a sense differently and capitalize on what's going on, I think is very, very helpful to our thinking about this going forward. So I'm very appreciative of the guidance that you've given us, Professor Brands, very much so. Thank you.
Joanne, one observation I'd make in talking with a lot of political folk and policymakers is, unfortunately, what's happening. I'm in Tobacco Road. So you have Duke and Carolina.
Right.
Politics are becoming a lot like worldwide wrestling or sports teams, where I root for Carolina, I root for Duke, I root for the Steelers, I root for the Cowboys, but that's it. I don't have any values invested. I root for them regardless of what they're doing because they're my team.
Yes.
Really, we're on Team America. And this is becoming a deeper conversation we're having with elected officials, is we have to be on Team America, not on these individual teams. All right, we have some questions. Also, we could put up a slide showing the book from Professor Brand. So, Craig, we'll call on you first.
Oh, thanks, Randy. Professor Brands, that was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate that. You're spot on. I come from rural Northwest Ohio, and one of the things that we could really benefit, as society could benefit as a whole, is a review of our history. Because you bring up so many good points about that, and I think when we profess about the National Infrastructure Bank, I'm on the advisory board. When we talk about this, and we give a lot of presentations, everything, one of the things that we come across more often than not is people that we talk to, elected officials, have forgotten about our history. They've forgotten that we've done this in the past. And when we remind them of when we have done this, crisis or no crisis, it's like, oh, and other countries are doing this, by the way, and this is the American model. More often than not, there's like, yeah, I can see the rationale here. I think we should be doing this. And we mentioned Eisenhower quite a bit. I will say, I have to chuckle a little bit about when you're talking about with President Obama, Teddy Roosevelt, and everything else. I wish he channeled Teddy Roosevelt a little bit more and gone after the big pharma during his time period and really implemented a national health care plan, a universal health care plan, when that crisis actually called for it during Clinton's time. And he had that opportunity to really cement his legacy during that period. And they really would have been more like Teddy Roosevelt, in my opinion. But I really appreciated your presentation, and thank you again.
Okay, so we want to have short, concise questions and address them to our speakers. I'll start from right to Gene Binder.
I don't know, question as much as a comment. Maybe it is a question. You're talking about transformative presidents. I think we've got one who is trying to achieve a transformation, and none of us can know how that's going to come out. And I don't see any way that you could get this bill passed in this present environment unless Trump got behind it. So I was wondering why the professor didn't bring in Trump.
Professor Brands, do you see Trump as trying to be transformative?
President Trump is the first real estate developer we've had as a president. He would seem a natural. The only thing is, he would probably take his 15% off the top. And,
Yes.
well, there are all sorts of other aspects of the Trump presidency that would make things difficult. And the bigger, sure, if Donald Trump came on board, it would give a boost. But then you'd run into the problem that the two parties are so wired that whatever one party gets behind, the other party feels obliged to oppose.
That's what I was saying.
I mean, at the moment, I gather, it's mostly Democrats who are behind this. And so that being the case, Republicans are against it. But imagine thinking of, liberal Democrats that you might know. If Donald Trump said this is a good idea, how many of them would still consider it a good idea? I don't know. I mean, there would be, some would, but there would be a whole lot of people who say, wait a minute, I don't trust this guy. There's got to be more to this. But anyway, it's a long-term project. And one of the serious problems is the fact that these days there's almost no issue that doesn't become politicized almost immediately. And whoever's taking the lead, then the other party decides that there's ground to be made by opposing it. And so this is sort of motivated that comment I made about try to give people as many reasons for as many modes of political cover as they need to do this. And it's possible. Well, first of all, Donald Trump's not going to be president forever. And if only because he's not going to live forever. And so there will be politics after Trump. And he is an old guy. So it's not going to be that far. And I think that I think Republicans who have been biting their tongues and just sort of rolling their eyes behind closed doors about stuff that Donald Trump has done will be looking for ways to reestablish the bona fides of the Republican Party. And this might be something they could do. I mean, you pose it as an investment in America's future, which of course is what it is. And people talked about earlier times, well, the greatest time of infrastructure building in the United States was during the Gilded Age, when railroads were being built and canals were being built and highways were built and everything was being built. And it was sort of like the model of an infrastructure bank in many cases, especially in the transcontinental railroads, but also in state railroads and highways, a public-private partnership. And so the feds provided guarantees and they provided some startup money, but then there was private money behind it as well. And it was the period of most rapid growth in the American economy. Now, with the growth came some stuff that people didn't like at the time and haven't liked since. And so when people talk about growing inequality in the United States today, they call this the second Gilded Age. And maybe that comes with the territory of the way we Americans have historically and collectively decided to run our economic affairs. We have opted for a capitalist economy. I mean, by no means it is a perfect capitalist economy. In effect, the US economy is about 40% socialist. The various levels of government, they account for about 40% of GDP. So we're far from a purely capitalist economy. But the point is that when the American economy grows rapidly, sometimes it's accompanied by growing inequality. And then you have to decide, okay, is reducing inequality more important than raising the scale of economic affairs generally? So the average American was better off in 1899, say roughly at the end of the Gilded Age, than in 1870 when it started. However, so that the average American income was higher than it was. The average person was better off compared to where that person had been before. But compared to John Rockefeller, no. And so there were some people who said, well, wait a minute, I don't like this. And so that's something you're going to have to work out. Do all boats have to rise at the same speed? Are you going to begrudge? Sometimes the way I put it to my students is, if John Q. Public's standard of living is improving, but not as fast as John D. Rockefeller's standard of living is improving, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna try to slow things down so that John D. Rockefeller doesn't get farther ahead than John Q. Public? Or are you gonna look at John Q. Public simply on his own terms? And he's better off than he was. So that might very well come with the territory. I'm not sure. Frankly, I think it would be a mistake to try to say, and this infrastructure bank is going to battle inequality as well. I think there you'd be losing support for the most modest gains. I mean, that's because immediately, and you're already going to have trouble with people who are going to brand this a socialist exercise. Now, if you add in, and it's going to shrink inequality, well, one of the ways you shrink inequality is take from the rich folks. You know? And so, I mean, in effect, that's the way it's going to come off. That will be the way it will be criticized. And Americans have never warmed up to anything called socialism, Bernie Sanders notwithstanding. You know, the United States class politics has never gotten anywhere in American history. And this because Americans have never, I mean, all evidence to the contrary, Americans as a whole have never considered themselves members of a class, except the utterly undescriptive middle class. Everybody says they're middle class. They're not. They're working class people and they're upper class people. But in the American psyche, the lower class has never been willing to say, and literally stick it to the rich, and we'll get better that way. Because enough members of the working class think, well, I might never be rich, but my kids might be rich, and I don't want them taxed at 90% when the time comes. So socialism has never really gotten anywhere in the United States when it called itself socialism. Sometimes it slipped in the back door. So anyway.
I'd like just to ask you a quick question, Professor. The Stock Repurchase Act that FDR got through that then Reagan repealed in '82, how did that get passed? Because that's totally separate from RFC Infrastructure Bank, but it was a policy that did level things a bit. And the fact that it's been removed has actually changed things in our economy in the last 4 years. I'm just curious your take on that.
I'm afraid that requires a granular level of expertise I don't have.
Okay.
So I can't answer that question.
Fair enough. Carrie Green, you've had your hand up.
It's Carrie Gardner from Night Green. Hi.
Okay, sorry.
I'm a little confused and I'm trying to follow this as well. I unfortunately came on a little late, but I'm getting a sense that you're saying historically, I think the main point that I've just heard you talk about is socialism is not something that will happen or take off in the United States. So my question is, how do you explain Zohran Mamdani winning the primary?
Wow.
New York is New York. New York isn't the rest of the country. So, I mean, that's the simplest answer to that question. I mean, maybe he'll be mayor of New York. Maybe he'll be a great mayor of New York. I don't think he's going to be a governor of New York, and I certainly don't think he's going to get any farther than mayor of New York. In the rest of the country, being mayor of New York is not a stepping stone to anything else. So in much of the rest of the country, that is prima facie grounds for disqualifying whoever the mayor of New York happens to be for higher office.
I think it has national implications if he wins the mayoralty.
Well, you can certainly hope so. I mean, I don't have any historical basis for thinking
I think what's different now is, social media and the youth vote is working to change things as they understand growing inequality. And I also am of the world that believes that Bernie Sanders would have won had the centrist Democrats allowed him to win. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Earl, you've been very patient. You have to unmute. Thank you, Earl.
Yes, thank you. Good to see your presentation, and I enjoyed much your book on Ben Franklin and read your book on finance, although I was hoping it would include something about public banks. And so I want to applaud your comment about how to get a public bank passed, and that's to emphasize its ability to strengthen a country. In history, dominant countries that are threatened by a rising rival have been the chief provokers and instigators of war. And I would recommend 3 books about World War I and II by Jim McGregor. Jerry Doherty was his co-author on 2 of them, and John O'Dowd on the other, showing that the big banks in London and Wall Street backed by the elites, especially in Great Britain in World War I and both countries in World War II, were the chief factors in causing those wars because they were threatened by the rivalry of Germany and its rising economic power and wanted to take it down twice. Currently, we're in a similar situation. And I want to comment that Germany has had a very strong public banking system with nonprofits. A lot of it's private and a lot of it is city-owned savings banks, but they are funding small businesses. This is capitalism, but small businesses that create the most jobs. And our current situation, you mentioned China, and your proposal to brand this as strengthening the country. China has public banks that are being used to fund small businesses at the local level, some of them nationally owned, some of them not. And that's made China the fastest growing economy for 4 decades now. Japan has had a similar experience, which had something to do with our taking on Japan in World War II. And Russia has publicly owned banks that have helped them maintain a stronger economy. They've done it more through national funding, which is not as good as the way China has done it. And finally, the current war in Ukraine is related to this. The United States and Great Britain are declining relative to the rest of the world and to these countries that are funding many more jobs and economic growth than the United States can with their domination by big private banks. And a key factor is that 97% of our money is created by private banks when they make loans. And that is devastating to an economy that is not being funded by those banks. They make most profit on war, on fossil fuels, on private prisons, things that do not really help the economy, toxic chemicals. And having public banks with laws that require them to lend for public purposes and small businesses that create the most jobs is the way to do that. And I think you're identifying that as a way for a president without a serious crisis to characterize his campaign as extremely important.
Earl, is there a question in there, or is it that was a comment? Is there a question?
I'll take it as a
Okay.
question.
Okay, Professor.
I mean, I would say that in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt summoned Congress to Washington to special emergency session to deal with the banking crisis, the United States was closer then to having a nationalized banking system than it has ever been before or after. If at that moment, when the country was ready for this radical change that I've described, the recognition of what was going on in the Depression, if Roosevelt had said, you know what, the federal government is simply going to absorb all the banks. We're going to take off their assets and their liabilities, and we're going to run this banking system. Maybe we'll peel off some of them, maybe we'll leave some to the states, but the US is going to take over the big banks. And Roosevelt didn't. He conspicuously didn't. And it was the smartest thing he ever did. Because if he had, he would have blown the possibilities for the New Deal right out of the water. Because there was not any groundswell for national banks, for government-run banks. There never had been in American history. There wasn't then, even though that was the time of greatest crisis. Roosevelt was in a position, sort of the position that Donald Trump is in now, where what Roosevelt said he wanted, the Democrats in Congress gave him. That's why the 100 days lasted 100 days. He originally brought them into session to deal simply with the banking crisis, but they were so amenable to his dictates that he said, well, let's keep them around. Let's deal with some other stuff, get all this stuff out of the way. So they kept him in there.
Yes, but it was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, once Jesse Jones, a Democrat from Texas, took it over. And started lending money directly into the economy, which had not been done under Hoover, that's what really brought the economy out of the Great Depression. He didn't
No, no,
need
no.
he
That's not
didn't
true.
need to nationalize the bank. He had a national bank that was lending a great $40 billion to $50 billion
The
in the
United States
economy.
economy remained in a depression until 1940. And what brought the United States out of the depression was the fiscal stimulus that was designed toward preparing for war. And the RFC
But
facilitated some of this, but
that
this
was
was a
later.
much bigger deal. This was a much broader deal. And, the fact of the matter is that the United States retained this private first banking system that made its economy the envy of the world, even until today. And Germany would love to have America's economy right now. And, so the United States economy, it has its problems, there's no question about it. But over the last 200 years, the United States economy has been the wonder of world history. Now, we can say, well, it's not going to continue. I mean, maybe not. I mean, good things don't last forever. But until now, people who have bet against the United States have always lost. And, I'm not going to say by any means that they're going to continue to lose. Yeah, so sometimes things will change. And we've heard reasons for thinking that we're at that moment of big change. But I would just say, and you may be right, but the burden of proof is on the people who say, this time it really is different. This time we really have to act. And it is the hardest thing in the world to get people to take expensive measures against things that haven't happened yet. And I live in Texas, and Texas suffered some devastating floods this summer. And it's not as though heavy rains had never occurred in the Texas Hill Country, but there had never been floods in that particular place along the Guadalupe River. And there had been warning systems put in place 40 years ago, but nothing happened. There weren't any big floods. And so gradually the system needed maintaining and required money, and that I will spend the money on something else. And I'm from the Pacific Northwest. Everybody who knows anything about the geology of the Pacific Northwest knows that there is a devastating earthquake that's just awaiting offshore, and the Juan de Fuca plate is going to move, and there's going to be this tsunami that's going to sweep across the western half of Oregon. And anytime you go out to Oregon for the last 20 years, if you're anywhere near the coast, you see signs that say tsunami evacuation zone. So there it is right in front of you. And the first time you see it, you say, oh boy, I mean, we really got to worry about that. But the 100th time you pass by it, you don't even see it. It is a fact of human nature that if you can put off expensive fixes for things that haven't happened yet, they're going to get put off.
I'll put a pin right there, Professor, because that's a fact of local governance. You can sit there and tell people we need a new wastewater treatment plant, and they'll always wish delusionally it'll be cheaper 2 years from now or three. It never gets cheaper, by the way.
No, that's
That
one thing about
magical thinking.
infrastructure. It always gets more expensive.
Exactly. Ellen Brown, you've been patiently waiting. Ellen?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments and one question. First of all, it seems to me that we could characterize this as a war with China. It's an economic war, and China is running circles around us in infrastructure, and we need to do the same, and we could. We've got the means, etc. So that's one thing. The Bank of North Dakota is our only public bank at the moment, and it was founded by a political party that originally was socialist, and the farmers would not talk to a socialist coming around knocking on their door. So they changed the name to the Nonpartisan League. And that's when they want to, so it's like what you said. And here's my question. I'm shocked to hear you say that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation didn't pull the country out of the Depression. I thought it funded the New Deal and all those things, the Tennessee Valley Association.
It did, but that didn't end the Depression. It was very much too small to do anything about it. The deficits that the New Deal ran during peacetime were on the order of a couple $2 billion a year. And that wasn't anywhere near enough. Once the United States went to war, the annual deficits went to $20 billion a year. That's what was required. to get the country out of the Depression. But the thing is, without the war, there was no political support for deficits of that nature. Americans had never heard of anything like that, had never seen anything like that. And Franklin Roosevelt kept promising to try to balance the budget because, he himself was conservative enough that he wasn't a Keynesian. He wasn't going to adopt that radical philosophy by that crazy English economist. What he needed was political cover to do it. And it was the rise of Nazi Germany that did it.
You're missing the role that Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury,
Who's speaking?
He convinced.
It's Earl.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Morgenthau convinced Roosevelt to cut funding to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and give it to the Treasury to try to balance the budget. That was in about 1937 or 38.
37, exactly.
Right.
And it was because
the economy immediately crashed.
Exactly.
Down.
And the reason Roosevelt
sharply for 4 or 5 months, and Roosevelt realized that Jesse Jones at the RFC was correct, and he restored that money, and the economy quickly came back up. That's all in Stephen Fenber's books called Unprecedented Power that everyone should read about the RFC.
Go on, Professor Brands. You were saying something there?
I was just going to say that the reason Roosevelt cut back on the deficits in 37 was he thought he'd gone too far. Roosevelt was not convinced that deficits were the answer. And so he got nervous after his big victory in 36, excuse me. And he said, okay, it's time to cut back. And you're right. When he did, then the economy lost all the ground that it had made since 1933. And so in the fall of 1937, the economy was back to where it was when Roosevelt was inaugurated. And so Roosevelt said, I guess I need to basically restore those deficits, get the spending back up. And things did improve, but they didn't get anywhere near their levels of 1929 until the country began to rearm for war.
But it was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that funded our participation in World War II, right?
No, it may have handled the disbursements, but it was the Lend-Lease Act, and it was all the various other measures that were designed to simply put the economy on a war footing. The government took over the economy. So, one could argue that this is the way the United States should do it now. One could make this argument. We need a command economy. Simply get rid of capitalism and let the White House dictate which industries are going to produce how much, because that's exactly what happened during World War II. And World War II is remembered in American thinking as the good war. And the people who were associated with and fought in World War II are called the greatest generation. This is pretty ironic to say that the good war was this war that killed 60 million people, and the greatest generation was the generation who was involved in that horrible war. But it did pull the country together politically because, and this is the tempting thing about war for democratic politics, not big D Democrat, but Republican, the politics of democracy. Once you go to war, then your political opponents are not simply your political opponents. They are potentially traitors. And they are disloyal, and you can treat them that way. And Roosevelt, in fact, began doing this even before the United States went to war. He called people who were opposed to intervention in the war, he called them disloyal. He called them fifth columnists. He called them copperheads after the traitors of the pro-Confederate groups of the Civil War. And Roosevelt was shameless in this. And this was before the United States went to war, when these people were simply exercising their First Amendment rights to oppose particular policies proposed by the Roosevelt administration. But it's really tempting for presidents because during wartime, you can act as a dictator, basically. And you can restore the economy.
Recognize Dr. Michael Roberto. I think you've written a book on Faster Than the American Behemoth. If you'd like to ask a question, you're not on the main screen, but texted me if you want to ask a question. Jim Hanley.
I actually think that Randy Grain is ahead of me.
Okay. All right, Randy.
Thanks, Jim. I'll try to make this quick. First, I have to agree that there is a certain temptation to to simply declare war of some kind and move forward. That's why Trump's doing it right now. And yes, it's frightening, the amount of power that has. A couple of things in no particular order is the mention about China coming after us, or our position rather strong, is fairly relevant. They're supposed to have, what is it, 3 national infrastructure banks? But we're seeing kind of an opposite problem where I live from having to find arguments that Republicans will live with, because not all of the radicals live in New York City. As a matter of fact, I'd say that none of them do, compared to Washington State. I've got people that are upset that Adam Smith endorsed it. How do I speak to a more liberal crowd that is concerned about, well, frankly, corporate giveaways?
There you go. That's not an easy question.
Yeah, you got a problem because, well, I mean, whether it's corporate giveaways or the growth of a new behemoth fascist state, you're going to give power, you're going to give centralized power to people who have the money to put their policies into effect. And I mean, especially if this is a public bank, it's going to be run by people appointed by elected officials. So these, I mean, in American history, that has not been a recipe for engendering public confidence. To say, you know what, we're going to make government bigger and more powerful. You can get away with it during wartime because the alternative is we might lose the war and the Germans might take over us, or the Japanese might invade California or something like that. I mean, Abraham Lincoln could take on autocratic tendencies during the Civil War. He could lock up the Maryland state legislature. He could suspend the writ of habeas corpus. He could ignore decisions by the Supreme Court. And he said, I have to do this to save the Union. If I say, okay, I am going to, we're going to honor habeas corpus in all circumstances. And if by that means we destroy the Union, if we lose the Constitution because we won't allow one clause of the Constitution to be suspended during wartime, then we'll never win. And so you see this again and again in American history. Randolph Bourne, a liberal or progressive from the early 1900s, 1910, he said that war is the health of the state. And he was one of those progressives who opposed American entry into World War I for fear that it would crush the progressive spirit of the previous decade and a half, because it was going to make government so domineering. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson, who had been a good progressive from the time he was governor of New Jersey until his first term as president, he presided over the first sort of nationalized war economy, where for 18 months, the federal government ran American big industry. And directives came from Washington. You're going to produce this, you're going to produce that. And by the way, you guys can't strike, don't ask for wage increases, the whole thing. And this is not going to be a selling point for a national infrastructure bank. I mean, it may be that those of you who support it think that, well, politicians will make better decisions than corporations, but I don't think most Americans are going to agree with you. Or at least I'll put it this way, you have a job to convince them that the bureaucrats making the decisions for the National Infrastructure Bank are going to make better decisions than Jamie Dimon.
Well, that's not hard.
Jim?
Try it
Jamie
and see.
Dimon has a vested interest in making decisions that are best for him, not anybody else.
But that's the secret of, and I'll put it from Jamie Dimon's standpoint. That's the secret of the success of the American economy. He makes money when you make money. That is, if you're a depositor in his bank, if you're somebody who's borrowing money from him, because the interests of his bank and the interests of you are aligned. Whereas you give it to a government official, he's playing with somebody else's money. He doesn't really care whether this bank makes any money or not. He's got a job. I mean, this is the argument that you'll have to overcome. Now,
Oh, that's an easy argument to overcome, because we saw what happened with we saw what happened with say Bank of America and Chase during 08. They were not working in the best interest of their of the people who had borrowed from them. Matter of fact, they stole from a lot of people.
Well, the fact of the matter is that if people didn't like what Jamie Dimon and Chase Bank were doing, they could take their money and put it elsewhere, but they didn't.
That assumes that we have free markets. Markets are
There are hundreds of banks in the United States.
They're all consolidating, and that's part of the problem.
Between where I live in downtown Austin and the University of Texas, I go past 5 or 6 banks you've never heard of, I've never heard of. And in fact, I got to know some of the people who head these banks. I say, so what's your niche? How do you compete with the big banks? I say, well, we get to know our customers. But the fact of the matter is, at least in Texas, and I know this is true in other states, there are lots and lots of banks around. And it may be true that for certain things, you don't get the same interest rate that JP Morgan Chase is going to give you. But if you're worried about the strength of JP Morgan Chase, I mean, just like if you don't like Google, you can find another search engine, but you might decide on balance, Google's pretty good. Okay, maybe it collects information on me. If you really don't like the information they collect on you, go use DuckDuckGo or something like that. These are the trade-offs in life.
Jim, you've been waiting.
Thank you, Randy.
Uh-huh.
I think, Mr. Brand, I might be foolish to challenge a historian who's written history books.
Historians are fair game. Go right ahead.
However, you're making the assertion that it was World War II that got the country out of the Great Depression. And your audience here and your advocates here have a different view. We believe that it was a public bank. It was a Reconstruction Finance Corporation that supplied the capital that was necessary to employ people who had no jobs. I think there were really basically 2 elements to the Great Depression. And one of them was the collapse of agriculture. There was a drought, there was the Dust Bowls, and a lot of people were living on farms. At the time, they could not make a living any longer. But in the cities, people were laid off because of the market crash. And without consumer demand, the ripple effect was huge, and businesses lost money, they closed. And so the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and I think that if we wanted to settle this question about which was the bigger factor between, was it the Work Progress Administration and the New Deal, or was it World War II that got us out of the Great Depression, is that we could look at employment numbers. As I understand it, near 1932 or so, maybe when the Depression was in its worst, condition, I think the unemployment rate was about 25%. So if we wanted to take a look and see, what was the bigger factor? Was it the Works Progress Administration, the New Deal? We could look at those employment numbers to see if there was a significant impact on employment before the country began to tool up for World War II. So, we, as I said, we advocates for public banking believe that it was the New Deal that did it. And the New Deal was funded by a public bank. Now, there's another thing I would like to ask you to do, and we appreciate your presence here today, I'm sure, is that take a look at governance of the National Infrastructure Bank. This is not a government bank. this bank is not going to be run by politicians. This is not going to be giveaways, good buddy, contracts given out. And we think that slowly we're building confidence in the fact that there will be arm's length from government to this bank, and that the loans are well defined in the bill itself. That we're not going to be building football stadiums or parking garages. There's not going to be real estate speculation. That there's one more point I'd like to make, and you talk about your observation of banks. We need to look at the statistics, not just what we're observing. There are a lot of banks on the street. Wall Street banks are dominating this economy. And for a long time, have they not only have they not contributed to economic growth, but they're a brake on it, because they're not lending to small businesses. We don't see it. In fact, Ellen mentioned the Bank of North Dakota. Just one more piece of evidence. There's about 60 distinct financial institutions in North Dakota. In Arizona, there are 14. And of those 14, 3 banks control about 80% of deposits in this state. And what we have is a situation where we have all these bank branches collecting deposits, not lending on them, especially the small businesses. They will lend to purchase assets. They will lend to purchase real estate. And I think that because that's been going on so long, we have a bubble in real estate, because banks have been lending to purchase real estate. It's not productive.
Okay, Jim, I think we
speculative.
said Professor Brand's response.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Professor Brands, I mean, you heard what he said. Is there, do you want to respond or just let it stand?
I'll sort of respond to that one and the previous one, and that is, yeah, because we can't do a counterfactual experiment where we can't rerun the Great Depression and take out the RFC and see what happens. We can't run the 1930s and without World War II coming at the end and see what happens then. Now, in an idealized world of social science experiment, we would do that. Well, we can't, which means that the people who say that if not for this, that would have happened, they can say that all they want and nobody can prove them wrong. Because if you start with an assumed premise, there's no way of proving that to be false. Herbert Hoover went to his grave. He lived another 30 years. He lived to the early 1960s. And Herbert Hoover went to the grave convinced that he had solved the problem of the Depression, that through his steady management of the economy, he had allowed the waste, the excess to be wrung out of the economy the way happens in recessions all the time. And through the RFC, by its judicious lending to businesses rather than to individuals, he had set the basis for restoring investor confidence. Hoover was enough of a conservative to believe that investor confidence was crucial to get those investors off the fence, get them back into investing. Because at the heart of the Great Depression was a shortfall of demand. There wasn't enough demand. And so if they thought, okay, prices are falling, I can build a new factory, I can open a new plant over here, dig a new mine, then I'll take advantage of this. And Hoover, looking at his own crystal ball, said in his memoirs years later, he said, by the end of the summer of 1932, I could see that the recession had run its course. I could see the first glimmers of improvement. But then that crazy Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and he talked about all these ludicrous things that he was going to do and spooked the investors, who were the key to bringing the American business cycle back into forward motion. And then came the New Deal, and then came all this stuff, and that's why the Depression lasted so long. Now, I don't believe Hoover. Hoover believed Hoover. Plenty of American conservatives believed Hoover. I'm saying this just by way of saying that if you imagine a world where this thing that did happen didn't happen, If Franklin Roosevelt hadn't been elected, then you can say, well, everything would have been great. So, if you want to give full credit to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation for ending the Depression, I can't talk you out of it. I just don't believe it. And the timing doesn't work for me. The number of unemployed who were employed by the government was just a small fraction of the number that were employed when the economy moved into high gear. That 25% of the American workforce. Government employment didn't come close to covering that. But once the United States began gearing up for war, then all those laid off ship workers and all those laid off auto workers and everybody else, they had jobs. It was a proof of the principle of Keynesianism. If the government spends enough, it can bring the economy back into its old form again. But in the United States, the only time government has been willing to spend enough is during wartime, because then you can say it's for the security of the country. Or there's one other example. During COVID, if the government spends enough money during COVID, we can end a recession just like that. Of course, the other side of the Keynesian equation is you can spend more than you take in during bad times, but you got to take in more than you spend during good times. And over the long run, things have to even out. But of course, we haven't learned that lesson. And our deficits are even greater during prosperity than they've been during wartime.
We have two last questions. It'll be Michael and Abby. Earl, I'm sorry, and Joe will have to get back to you. And I want to thank our guests. I could go on all night because I love these kind of hot box conversations. So Michael, Roberto, we tried a couple to get to you. Are you unmuted now? And if you want to ask a question?
I'm here, Randy.
Okay.
First of all, folks, I want to apologize for the Christmas tree in the background, and I don't look like that anymore. So here's my question for Professor Brands, and I'm an historian, and I wrote a book on the origins of fascism in the United States. And in order to do that, I really had to study Roosevelt very carefully. So here's my question for you, Professor Brands, and then I'll make a couple of comments and give you an opportunity to sort of respond. Would you say that at the time of his death, FDR was a man at odds with himself because he believed in the false dichotomy of good versus bad capitalism? Now, hang on to that question, and let me just make a few remarks about the National Infrastructure Bank, which I support wholeheartedly, not only as a professional historian, but also as a citizen, and also as somebody who has really struggled for a very long time in my own city of Greensboro, North Carolina, to bring about the kind of necessary changes in order for the municipality to enter the 21st century on an equitable basis. First of all, I want to say that this is a crisis. This is a crisis that is far beyond the 1930s crisis in magnitude. This is a crisis, a structural crisis of the American empire at home and abroad. And for all the figures and statistics that were provided tonight by Professor Brands and as well as others, I would say that the statistics definitely point to an acute crisis that has become acute as a result of a protracted crisis that set in the 1970s, a crisis of financialization of the economy, the financialization which made petrodollars supreme to the dollar itself, the breaking of Bretton Woods, which cast the whole global economy into a tailspin. And we've seen, not a tailspin, but sort of like a gradually building tsunami, where the results today are such that in the United States, to talk about a ruling class, we're talking about 0.01% at the top, 9.9% below them, and the rest of us are basically working class people. Why? What does this have to do with a national infrastructure bank? simply this: a national infrastructure bank is now one of the greatest social democratic responses to the peril of fascism, if we define fascism as the rule of capital itself. And I'm certainly not the first to say this, although many more people in the 1930s were saying this, whether they were liberals or communists. And it was the united front against fascism that helped Roosevelt get beyond his own crises of 1937 and 1938. And let me just say that
Okay, Michael, we,
a national infrastructure bank would be part of a transition toward social democracy and away from fascism. And it wouldn't be about roads and bridges as much as it might be about a rail system. It wouldn't be about governance and direction from the top. It would be facilitated by the Congress of the United States, and it would be distributed to states and municipalities, who would then decide what kind of infrastructural changes would need to be made.
thank you very much, Michael.
Thank
Okay, you had a question at the beginning,
Yes.
Mr. Brands, if you want to respond to that FDR question.
I don't remember the FDR
It
question.
was
but
basically he's at odds with himself.
Was he at odds with himself?
I've
studied Franklin Roosevelt with some care for about 20 years, and I have no confidence that I know at any moment in his life what he thought. He was more closely guarded with his own feelings than any public figure I've ever encountered. So I don't know the answer to that question.
Fair enough. Abby, you got the last question. Thank you very much, Michael.
Yes.
Abby, you have to unmute and ask your question.
Yep, I'm unmuted. Thank you. I just wanted to respond, and I don't know if there's a question in this, because I worked in banking. I used to distinguish Main Street banking for decades in government and private sector. And when I was following as closely as I could all the news coming out around 07, 08, 09, I needed a job because I had moved back from California to DC. And I felt like it seemed to me like the press was that Jamie Dimon was one of the good guys who was doing a lot of good things. So maybe, and things came out later that maybe he wasn't doing as many good things, or there were other things going on. I just felt like people didn't know, so they wouldn't have left his bank because they thought he was doing good things to help the country get through the major crisis we were in. Does that seem, what do you think, Professor Brand?
I think to give a straightforward sort of yes or no answer regarding the activities of some institution as large as JP Morgan Chase would be difficult. I'll point out something historically. In 1895, there was a run on the US government's gold supply. The US Treasury was about to run out of gold. And to the rescue of the US government rode JP Morgan, the original JP Morgan. And he organized a consortium that loaned money to the Treasury of the United States to stave off default. That's 1895. JP Morgan goes to the rescue of the US Treasury. Jump forward to 2008, another financial crisis. This time, however, it's the US Treasury that goes to the rescue of JP Morgan. This time, the JP Morgan, the institution, but you get the point. So things have changed. The big banks of the United States are powerful today, but they were way more powerful in the 1890s. Now the heaviest hitter in the financial world, is the US Federal Reserve. Now it's this hybrid thing, but basically its charge is to represent the interests of the American economy as a whole. And so the big banks today are bigger than they ever were, but the federal government is even bigger than it ever was. So the United States has lived through a time when bankers and banks were even more powerful relative to the institutions of government than they are today. So it's a bargain we've made with the devil.
That's a good place to rest. I'd like to thank our guests, our panel that came on tonight. You did a wonderful job. I actually could do this for hours, Professor Burns. I love these kind of conversations because we don't have these kind of conversations enough in our day-to-day life. Just asking the tough questions and letting it fall and learning. Folks, for those that don't know, a resolution passed before NACO, which is the National Association of County Commissioners. It passed on July 14th. That's a very it's a bipartisan organization of county commissioners nationally, and it tends to be more red than blue. It's quite significant that we got a resolution endorsed by the National Association of Counties. Also, the Bossier-Parrish resolution passed August 6th by the Republican county commissioners in Speaker Mike Johnson's district in Louisiana. Very significant. There is an upcoming DNC conference in Minneapolis where we've got folks attending. Hopefully we can support them because getting people in the room and being there make all the difference. But one thing I can say is that our work on getting resolutions nationwide and the work of people like Carolyn Fowler and others is bearing fruit, because this resolution that is going before the DNC to support National Infrastructure Bank has a lot more support, including those from North Carolina, where the Labor Caucus actually, I think we told you last time, we passed that at our state convention. So we're making progress. It may seem incremental, but sometimes enough of this is going to actually break the dam. So you can go here and click on here to support. I really appreciate everyone coming on the call. Check out these slides, these new infographics. Obviously, we put up the information about Professor Brand's book as well. These are some great new infographics we have that you can share in social media or print it out or hand it out. But I will say that printing these things out and handing them out, which I've done at a couple of big events, has actually paid dividends because people are carrying these things forward. It's just sometimes the boots on the ground and the advocacy actually still works. Ellen, I'm going to have you on the show tomorrow, our radio show in Chapel Hill, so I look forward to chatting with you. I'd love to have you in the studio, but we know you're going to call on Zoom, so I look forward to that conversation tomorrow. Is there anything else? If not, I really appreciate people getting on the call, and we'll hopefully see you next month.
Great job moderating.
Thank you, Maryjane. I hope to meet some of you in person. Obviously, I know Stuart and Angela and others, but I hope to see you guys. You're always welcome if you come down to the Carolinas. We have plenty of room here.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great job. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.
Goodbye.